Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Philosophy Show. Once again, having the honor to be behind the mic and leading an episode, my name is Mihai Covaser. I am a second-year student at the University of British Columbia in the Philosophy, Political Science, and Economics program, and I am joined here by a couple of great guests to have a discussion today, Michael Robert Caditz and Aaron Wang. But before we get into the episode, we just like to remind our listeners that are listening on radio that you can find the archive of our shows in what is essentially a podcast form at www.mixcloud.com/The Canadian Philosophy Show. Again, that's mixcloud.com/The Canadian Philosophy Show. Join us there if you want to post comments, ask questions, and re-listen to our old episodes. And to get into our discussion today, I would love to introduce a subject that is quite interesting and quite contentious, I think, amongst the guests that we have here today. So I'm expecting some good debate, some good discussion. And it's an idea of Aristotle's that he presents in the Nicomachean Ethics, which is sort of the text, the philosophy text. If you're studying Aristotle, and for a lot of people's experience in education, that's what they go to. And I'll read the first paragraph from the 10th part of Book 1, which basically outlines the idea that we're talking about today, which is the possibility that someone's virtue and therefore their happiness, which again, we will explain what exactly Aristotle means by happiness, but essentially that can be affected by the descendants of a person and the events that happen after their death with regards to their honor and the image that they have in society, and that in turn impacts them as individuals even after death. So I'll read you that paragraph to start. Must no one at all, then, be called happy while he lives? Must we, as Solon says, see the end? Even if we are to lay down this doctrine, it is also the case that a man is happy when he is dead? Or is not this quite absurd, especially for us who say that happiness is an activity? But if we do not call the dead man happy, and if Solon does not mean this, but that one can then safely call a man blessed as being at last beyond evils and misfortunes, this also affords matter for discussion. For both evil and good are thought to exist for a dead man, as much as for one who is alive but not aware of them. For example, honors and dishonors, and the good or bad fortunes of children, and in general of descendants. And this also presents a problem, for though a man has lived happily up to old age and has had a death worthy of his life, many reverses may befall his descendants. Some of them may be good and attain the life they deserve, while with others the opposite may be the case. And clearly, too, the degrees of relationship between them and their ancestors may vary indefinitely. It would be odd, then, if the dead man were to share in these changes and become at one time happy, at another wretched, while it would also be odd if the fortunes of the descendants did not, for some time, have some effect on the happiness of their ancestors. So again, even he is kind of unsure, I'll end quote there, but even he seems kind of unsure of whether or not this proposal of his actually holds any ground. I know that Michael and Aaron, you both had some ideas on this subject. I'll turn to one of you to sort of kick the discussion off if you have a point of contention or a question here.
I don't think there's anything absurd at all about claiming that dead people cannot be happy or sad. I don't think there's anything absurd at all about saying that events after a person dies have absolutely zero bearing on the on the happiness or sadness of a dead person, because a dead person can't have properties at all, can't be sad, can't be happy. A non-existent thing has no properties. It's debatable whether we can even speak justifiably about a non-existent thing, but non-existent things certainly can't have properties, and they certainly can't have emotions, in my view.
I have a couple of retorts to that already, which is that I think Mikey's incredibly right. Like we can't really speak of people who have passed on as if they are alive, but the fact that they lived is a real physical fact, and their actions, their thoughts, their words, a lot of those are recorded in physical form and have huge impacts on our societies. Like we have the colloquialisms like this person must be rolling over in their grave when we say something they must not have liked in life and things like that. So that's where I'm coming from.
I'm going to agree with Aaron on this one, Mikey. And that is to say that I fundamentally, where I disagree with you is that things that do not have a physical referent in the real world can still have properties in the same way that they exist, which is to say they don't have physical properties because they don't exist physically. Let's say a concept, something in our mind. For example, a dead person. Say their body decays, they disappear. They still at once existed. We still hold something in our minds that is a representation of them. And therefore, in that image, in that representation, they can have qualities attributed to them, or at least that were attributed to them in the past. And one of these that he mentions is honor, right? Which is something variable and totally out of a person's control. And so those qualities, I think, are very real in a vocal, in a discourse sense of the term, and if not in a physical one.
Well, if we take, for example, a work of fiction, so let's say a story, a book, a film, whatever form of medium it's on. Let's say that the characters don't exist in the physical world; they're simply characters in a fictional story. Sure, we can talk about I agree with you. We can talk about those characters having certain qualities, properties, emotions, personalities, being happy or being sad. But it's very clear we're not talking about human beings. We're talking about fictional characters. We're talking about a story. We're talking about creations in the minds of people. So likewise, once a human being dies, that person no longer exists in the physical world. And likewise, if we talk about that person as being happy or sad, or personality traits of that person who no longer exists, we're doing nothing more, and nothing different than if we were talking about fictional characters in a story. So sure, we can say that person is happy or sad, but it's just a question of definition of person. Is it an actual person or is it a fictional character? And so a person who has died in the physical world becomes the equivalent, in my view, of a fictional character.
Aaron, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, you know me pretty well by now. So, our listeners are going to be in for a real shock here. So, in my childhood, I would watch something that I don't know if it still exists, but it was called Teletoon Retro. And that had a bunch of 80s TV shows on it that, as a child, I very much enjoyed. I really loved 80s TV shows, like the old Transformer shows, the He-Man show, the She-Ra show. I forget what the other ones were. But like these really, like the Scooby-Doo shows, like all those are great. I guess the thing is like after I grew up a little bit, I realized like these 80 TV show characters aren't real people; they're fictional characters, and part of me had like a real hard time with this because I really loved those characters, and it's like, okay, so Optimus Prime is not a real person, and I have to live in a world without Optimus Prime because he's not real. So it's like it was a hard moment in my childhood mind, but then at the same time I was like, okay, well wait a minute, like Optimus Prime isn't real. I remember I saw this film thing, this interview with the actor who played Optimus Prime, and it was him dialoguing with the actor who played Megatron, and it was really funny because they were talking about how they would always steal the same parking spot. But it was funny because I was like, okay, so the character doesn't exist, but the actor who plays the character does physically exist, and then the people who wrote the character do exist. So it's this really weird thing of like, so the fiction doesn't exist, but the fiction is a creation of real people who do exist, who have real ideas about the real world, and then communicate that through a medium. So, I can still, like, how much of fiction is a reflection of reality, and how much of fiction is, just in the minds of other people. Yeah, that's kind of what I have to deal with.
I want to grab onto that because that's very interesting. So to summarize what you said, correct me if I'm wrong. You have this idea that so there are real feelings, real ideas, real thoughts that real physical humans have, and they are simply communicated, sent out to audiences through a medium that is not dialoguing with that person explicitly. In other words, through the medium of allegory, of stories, right? Fictional characters, but the ideas are real in as far as we say ideas are real because they come from real people. Now, here's the art. I think that is precisely what explains Aristotle's argument for how one's descendants can continue to have bearing on someone as a person after they are gone. And I'm curious to see what Mikey has to say about this. But in essence, one's descendants are like the allegory that carries the ideas of voice actors and screenwriters. One's descendants often continue to hold and to keep present the thoughts or feelings or impressions that the person who is now gone had in life. If someone raises children, those children might keep some of the ideas that their parents taught them. And so in a very real sense, the thoughts, the ideas, the things that someone sent out into the world in life continue to live on. And in that sense, a representation of that person continues to exist past their death, which can be honored, besmirched, insulted, just like a real person can be. So, Mikey, I'm curious to see what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think we've sort of moved into the territory of epistemology here because we're really having a debate now, I think, about direct versus indirect realism. And I'll tell you what I mean. It's related to what you're saying. So it occurred to me that maybe I was wrong, or maybe not wrong, but maybe there's another point of view compared to what I said before, which is that what I said before was that when a person is physically alive, we are experiencing that actual person, and we can talk about that person's properties, happiness, unhappiness, personality, so on. But once the person is physically dead, then we're talking about a fictional character. And so there's a distinction between talking about a person who's alive and a person who's dead, the former being an actual thing and the latter being a fictitious character that exists only in people's minds. But there's another way of looking at it, which I think is might align more with what you're saying, Mihai, which is that in neither case, the case of a person who's physically alive or the case of a person who's died, are we actually talking about the actual person? We're talking about a representation of the person. So that would be an indirect realism in an epistemological sense. So it may be that at all times, whether the physical person is alive or the physical person is dead, we are experiencing a representation of that person through indirect representation rather than the person, him or herself. And so, in effect, nothing changes if the person dies because we're still continuing to interact with the same representation. And that representation continues to be efficacious, continues to matter to people, to have an effect on people, as you were suggesting, in the real world, just as when the person was alive, maybe even more so. Sometimes people in death, like many great artists in the past were ignored until they died, and then suddenly their artwork became very popular and they became famous, like Michelangelo and so on. Many of those artists were unknown and relatively unimportant and non-impactful, right, when they were alive, but when they died, their image and their reputation and their stature, increased dramatically. So so that's another way of looking at this, which I'll admit may be useful, which is that we're always dealing with representations of people, and in effect, nothing dramatically changes when the person physically dies.
And another thing that could possibly change how we're talking about this subject is a common criticism of Aristotle's virtue ethics, as he calls them, which I'll give a brief summary for audience members in case you are unfamiliar. Basically, the idea is that Aristotle thought that there was some good, some end, some ultimate purpose for human life that could be found, a single purpose, and that all of our actions and all of our pleasures and pains are ultimately subordinate to this one ultimate goal, which he called happiness. Happiness not in the sense of, oh, I'm happy because I just, had dessert for breakfast, but happiness as in a collection of all of the virtues that one can learn to embody in life, such that you are the most complete human being possible, the most virtuous, the most happy human being. So that's sort of, again, very Reader's Digest, very brief summary of Aristotle's virtue ethics. And the criticism is that his view of ethics and living a good life seems to be quite elitist, in that he bases a lot of his attainment of virtue and happiness on things external from us. He says that the fortune and the fortunes and misfortunes and the evils and goods that we experience from the outside, and the resources that we have access to in order to practice virtue, are intrinsic or essential to achieving a happy life. A good example, you were talking about the Trojan War, I think, in our last episode, Aaron, and you have the king of Troy, who lived a quite a great and good life, but at the very end of all things was slaughtered in his own castle by those who besieged his fortress and ultimately entered on the Trojan horse. So like, he lived a life of happiness essentially up until the point of his death. And he had no control over the fact that at the point of his death, he would be slaughtered, he would lose everything, and he would be wretched and be an unhappy person, according to Aristotle. And so if we agree with him that so much of it is based externally, as you say, Mikey, that we're dealing in representations, and that things external to us are the ones that contribute to our ultimate happiness, then we might say that that might be a way to support this idea of being affected after death, because those external factors that make you happy or unhappy continue to exist. But if you have a very internalistic view of it, that we make ourselves virtuous or happy from the inside by something intrinsic, then maybe that theory falls a bit short. Aaron, you seem to be wanting to jump in here. Go. I'm curious to hear you.
I'm definitely willing to jump in here and correct you on 2 points. Well, the first point is kind of trivial, and that's that, like, the king of Troy totally deserved what happened to him because he had it coming, because he stole someone's wife. And that's, like, if he hadn't done that, there wouldn't have been a war, wouldn't have been a story. There could have been relative peace between Troy and the other Greeks. Besides from that historical note, I think that we've gotten further away from Aristotle's view of purpose. That, I think, is really important for understanding his idea of happiness, is understanding the idea of life purpose and virtues. I especially wanted to chime in here and add something which I find very interesting from the political side of things, and that is that Aristotle was the tutor for Alexander the Great, who was one of the most famous political leaders in all of human history. And in a way, you can see that, like, the way Aristotle supported Alexander the Great, and then you see what Alexander the Great does, his appreciation for philosophy and knowledge is very, very useful for him as a ruler and a military commander. He founds 70 cities in 10 years during ancient times. He does ridiculous things on a grand scale. I mean, you compare yourself to Alexander the Great at any age, and it looks like you're a failure, because he just accomplishes more than you would think is humanly possible. And so there's this, I think, this ideal that Aristotle has of wanting people and seeing virtue to be like being like I think Alexander the Great is actually a really good example of Aristotle's ideals of virtue, of spreading culture, spreading prosperity, spreading trade, spreading your ideas over the known world. And I mean, Aristotle certainly, like, honored his teacher in spreading Greek culture and philosophy, including Aristotle's teachings. And in that way, Aristotle himself is an example of his philosophy in the fact that his writings lived on and exist today. So that representation of him is existing today, and we're still talking about it.
I was thinking, as you were speaking, Aaron, about Aristotle equating virtue with the spreading of ideas, the spreading of culture. the term spreading, and I was thinking how culturally biased that concept is, and perhaps Aristotle was. What if we were to uh, look through the lens of, say, a different type of culture rather than classical culture, or neoclassical culture, and let's say the way that many of the indigenous tribes lived in North America, or in other parts of the world, where they weren't spreading anything. They were simply existing in harmony with nature. Many of the indigenous peoples in North America were nomadic, and they lived a subsistence life of hunting or gathering, and they had a very rich culture, but they weren't trying to spread their culture. The idea of spreading is a very European, a very and then in the roots, of course, European culture, we have Greek, we have Aristotle and classical culture, the neoclassical culture, and the Renaissance. But we can trace back this idea of spreading, perhaps back to Aristotle and back to the classical Greek values. And then, of course, it was the Europeans that indeed colonized much of the world and spread their culture out. So I'm raising an objection here to the idea that spreading one's culture, being a powerful person who conquers other peoples, other nations, spreads one's culture around. I'm questioning and objecting to the idea that should be considered a virtuous characteristic. And to the extent that it is, it's a cultural bias. It's culturally relative that would be considered virtue, rather than living in peace and harmony with people around you, rather than trying to spread, rather than try and colonize, right, or convert people, or overpower people.
I'll just jump in here with a quick correction, or at least just to make sure we're on the same page here. So Aristotle had actually a very narrow and very specific view of virtue. He actually thought he narrowed it down to 9 virtues specifically, and that those would be all you need to live a full and complete and happy life. And I'll list them for you. He said they're wisdom, prudence, justice, fortitude, courage, liberality, magnificence, meaning in terms of money, magnanimity, and temperance with regards to anger and violence. So in an interesting way, first of all, I think Alexander the Great, your example, Aaron, may sort of rub on the wrong side of some of these, especially when we're talking temperance and his desire for spreading culture and forcing culture sometimes upon people that would otherwise not have desired it. But that being said, so first of all, I just wanted to make that point that he actually had a very specific idea of virtue. But what I wanted to say is, regardless of what you define as a virtuous life, I wanted to bring the discussion back to whether or not, like, again, regardless of how you define a virtuous life, what the point that we were discussing initially is that virtue exists irrespective of the actions, not entirely irrespective, but at least partially irrespective of the actions of the living person, which I think is where this main contention exists. Because you call a dead person, again, whether you call them a representation or a real person or what have you, you call that person virtuous or not, even if they're dead. You tend to think back at them, and whatever you think of them as having been a good or bad person, virtuous person. But also that what they left upon the world, i.e. their descendants and their ideas, continue to influence them, because those have some idea of goodness, badness, virtue, and they are what's left of that person after they're gone. So that's my sort of challenge to you, Mikey, is that regardless of how we define the issue, you can't separate a person's image, their identity as it has been shaped by the society in which they lived and the people around them that observe them. You can't separate that idea from the person in life or in death. So that identity is negotiated, first of all, and second of all, it remains after death. And I want to put that challenge to you, because I know your view is generally more physicalist, and rubs against mine a little bit.
Well, you're representing one approach, which is one viewpoint, which is that that something is to be judged in the context of its environment, and that this is actually an issue. It's a contemporary issue in science and in the social sciences. And the question is, should we judge people's actions, or in the case of science, should we? Well, here's an example. Like before it was known that cigarette smoking led to dramatic increase in the chances of getting cancer. Before it was known, was it unethical or not unethical for cigarette manufacturers to promote cigarettes? Now, the argument is a little bit complicated, because there's some evidence that even after the cigarette companies knew that it was dangerous, they suppressed that information. But let's say that in a perfect world, there was a time when it was not known scientifically that smoking caused cancer. And so cigarette companies were pushing their products, cigarettes. Well, now that we know, the environment has changed, the context has changed, there's been scientific advances, can we retroactively go back and blame the cigarette companies for being non-virtuous, right, for pushing a product that we now know to be cancerous? Or can we let them off the hook because they didn't know at that time? So does the virtuousness of the cigarette companies depend on scientific discoveries that came later? Or is there something intrinsically virtuous or not virtuous about selling a product that now we know causes cancer? So I think this is related to what you're saying. So can we does the worthiness, the worthy or blamefulness of behavior change as information changes, as the external things external to the actor changed? Can we actually say that the actions of that actor have now changed, or their quality or the way we should judge them have changed? I think that's the question. I'm not sure that I have a strong that I land strongly on one side or the other about that, Mihai, but I think I'm articulating the problem that you're describing. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so I can address that briefly. So I think that what we call virtue and how we identify virtue as pertaining to someone's identity are not necessarily inextricably tied. And what I mean by that is, I think it's a separate issue whether or not someone's qualities and virtues can be identified in life as compared to afterlife. I think that's separate from what we call virtue. So I think the challenge that I'm putting to you, because you had this claim at the beginning that a dead person is no different than a fictional person, that your direct realism claim. So the challenge that I put to you was that the identity of that person does not necessarily change or disappear just because their physical, body has ceased functioning. And I think it's a separate issue that what we call virtue, whether that can or can't change over time. So let me put you an example. You have a king from ancient times, classical Greece. You have a ruler of a Greek city-state, and they lead a life of prosperity for their people, and they do not commit any sort of thievery, adultery, violence, rare as that might be in ancient times. Let's pose this example. So they live what Aristotle will call a virtuous life. Then they pass away. My claim is that continuously from that point on, they have an identity that remains, and that because an identity is a collaborative thing. I think that's the main claim that I'm making. Because an identity is not just in the self, but it's collaborative with the people you interact with, their identity continues to exist. We can identify them as virtuous or not. and then they have children. Those children are awful people. They do all of the vices and sins of the ancient times. Um, you can then identify that king with being virtuous or not based on the knowledge that he passed on to his children. So his quality may change. And then let's say 200 years later, the sins that those kids committed are no longer considered sinful. Again, I think you can retroactively change the quality of that person's identity over time, but that identity remains regardless.
But in order to make that claim, Mihai, you would have to, well, that would entail an indirect realism. So I think it is still an epistemological issue because if the person's identity can change even when nothing about the actual physical person changed because the person's dead, right? So if the person's identity changes because of what people think of that person or discoveries that are made later, then that means that you were never actually interacting with that actual person. You were interacting with a representation. You were interacting with something that exists in your mind or other people's minds, not in that person, him or herself. So that's an indirect realism claim that when you interact with somebody and when you describe that person's characteristics or properties or identity, you are not describing something about that person, him or herself. You're describing something that's in your own mind or in other people's minds. It's similar to saying that if I look at a tree which is green, or I say it's green, it's not really the tree that's green. It's my experience of the tree that's green. The green is in my mind or in my experience. And if to bring a whole community of people into it, if we all agree that the tree is green, what we're really saying is that we all are having the same experience of greenness when we look at that tree. But I think, Mihai, in order to sustain your claim that a person's identity can change even when nothing changed about that physical person because the person's physically dead, I think you would have to concede that the identity of a person resides in other people's minds, not in that person, him or herself.
You are listening to the Canadian Philosophy Show. I am here with a couple of guests, Aaron Wang and Michael Robert Caditz. My name is Mihai Covaser, and we are discussing the Aristotelian view of virtue and bringing this now to a discussion of identity and whether or not that is something intrinsic or extrinsic. Aaron, I'll toss the mic over to you here because I'm curious to hear if you have any sort of questions or objections on what's been said so far.
Yeah, I've really been enjoying this conversation. I do want to add something to something I said earlier, just because I think Mikey made an excellent point on cultural context. And I just wanted to say, like, I don't approve of Alexander the Great's actions. I think that would be a huge essay to figure out if what he did was morally justifiable or not morally justifiable. But I just wanted to throw that out there as historical knowledge. So however you feel about that. With regards to identity being intrinsic and extrinsic, I think what we're getting to is fundamentally a linguistical problem, which is a big problem because none of us are linguists. But and I think this is where, in a sense, both Mikey and Mihai are right, is that in order for someone's sense of honor to change over time, there has to be a linguistic shift, a new source of knowledge, a new moral code, a cultural shift, maybe a change in leadership or something like that. And those types of shifts or changes in thoughts, changes in words, evolution of language, as language becomes more complex, the way we view things changes. And not just the way we view things, but our capacity to understand and perceive things fundamentally changes depending on how much language we have access to. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't think about. We should probably think about it a bit more, is that, like 500 years ago, people who spoke English didn't have access to the English language as we have it, which means they might not necessarily have access to all of the concepts and that we have developed and taken from other cultures that exist in the English language today. So how would it even be possible for someone from an ancient culture or even a medieval culture to view things the way we view them, basically because we have different languages, we have categories and terms that they just didn't have in their language. So I think that is just a very real problem, and I think we're getting to the tip of the iceberg there.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that actually is good support for the point I'm making here, Mikey. And I will concede to you that I think my argument relies on that that sense of indirect realism. And I think what Aaron just said it supports that premise. And the reason I say that, I'll give another example, which is archaeologists and sociologists were working on this project, and I learned about it a little while ago. But basically, they were looking through ancient visual representations from ancient Greece, paintings, things that are colored, and they were identifying that many colors. They were using many colors and they had names for them. But one color that was never really present in their painting was the color blue. And linguists were puzzled about this too, because there wasn't actually a word for blue in ancient Greek as far as it was recorded. And I apologize that I can't bring up the source of this research right now. If someone in the audience would like to correct me on this, feel free on Mixcloud, where you can find the archives of this show. But they essentially found that the Greeks must not, they posit that the ancient Greeks must not even have had a mental representation, a perception of the color blue the same way we have it. And they instead basically saw blue as a shade of green. And that's why everything they paint, everything they write about, they never identified the sky or the ocean as blue. They use the same word as they do for green. And so this is exactly, Michael, what you were saying before, is that those people agreed on a perception of the world that could be radically different from the perception of the world we have today. Which is to say that, yeah, the same thing could be applied to people, and that personal identities, depending on how we view the world, whether we believe the world is enchanted and filled with gods and a creation of God, or whether we see it as purely scientific, is one good example. That changes how we form and think about identity. And that inherently contributes to how we name people, how we identify people, and the characteristics we give them. And so, yes, it's the way we're arguing right now, I would stick to that claim that it's maybe people's identities are really, for the most part, based on perception, because they are collaborative and because they're based on how we see the world at the current time that we're naming people or naming their virtues. And so that would in fact be in support of my argument earlier.
Yeah, I just want to clarify something just for the sake of preciseness. So when I was talking about indirect realism versus direct realism, I was really making an analogy because I believe that those terms normally apply to sense perception. And I was making an analogy. I was jumping from sense perception into talking about people's, reputations and the way we judge their virtuousness. And I'm not sure that we could accurately say that those questions are really questions of indirect versus direct realism. But I was making an analogy, right?
I applied the terms. I applied the terms as you gave them.
Invoke those terms, right? Right. So I just want to make sure that I'm not making the claim that that we're talking about that we can leap from sense perception to our experience of people. That's not a question of sense perception, right? It's more a question of like psychological or social questions. Yeah, but I was making an analogy, right? But having said that, I think this is in part a language issue, because if I talk about, so-and-so's reputation, whether so-and-so is virtuous, the question is, am I talking about that person intrinsically, or am I talking about the cultural experience or the community or the common or my experience of that person? So I think that's the ambiguity, and that's really a language issue. So if I say John is virtuous, am I talking about John intrinsically, or am I talking about society's opinion or my opinion of John. And it's not something that we normally clarify, right? We just talk about John being virtuous. I think that's a problem. It's a problem of language in part, because it's not clear when we talk about John whether we're talking about the physical John or things that are intrinsic to John, or whether we're talking about the way that John is adjudged by society. And I think that's the issue here. But I stand by my initial claim that that if you are going to claim, if you, Mihai, or anyone's going to claim that somebody's qualities can change after the person's dead, then I think you're committing yourself to the idea that that we don't interact with the actual person, but we interact with a like a psychological image of that person, or representation of that person in our minds as a society. And so as society changes, that representation changes. But obviously that actual person can't change because the person's, dead.
Yeah, one of the fundamental axioms of studying history is that the past does not change. However, our interpretation of the past does change. So, yeah, I just felt the need to add that to this discussion. The other thing I'd like to add is, a long time ago, if people really want to go deep into the Mixcloud archives, I did a show on perceptions and abstraction based off of the work I did in my systems design course. And in that show, we talked about you have sense perceptions, your 5 physical senses. You have your intuition, or your 6th sense, which is what it feels like to be in your own body. And then you have mixed perceptions, which are your moods and your emotions. And that the human experience, while we can divide these things into these different categories of perception, actually exists in all of these categories at once. And I think this is, to drive Mikey's point a little bit further home, a lot of the time we don't think about like, oh, am I like mad at this person because they did something objectively physically wrong, like they, cut in line in front of me in the grocery store? Or is it just because, they said something that triggered a mood or emotion within me based off of my prior experience? And so then that's, more subjective. So yeah, that's what I wanted to contribute.
It's interesting how we've also drifted into, I think, ethical issues, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. It's interesting in philosophy how there's such overlap, right? But I think this is an ethical issue because in ethics, it's very important to understand the distinction between is and ought. And the practice of ethics is not an empirical practice. It's not empirical investigation. It's not a what is investigation. It's a what ought to be. And unless you subscribe to a widely discredited now relativistic theory of ethics, like some kind of cultural relativism, where what's moral or not depends on what the culture believes. So unless you subscribe to that, which you're going to probably get booed out of most classrooms and universities, if you believe that there's some kind of objective morality, objective moral standards that cross-cut cultural bounds, and some cultures are simply wrong, ones that like Hitler was simply wrong. It's not a relative matter. So I guess what I'm saying here, the way it relates back to what you're talking about, Mihai, is that it may be that a person's reputation, or whether a person is considered to be virtuous or not, changes depending on events that happen, cultural events that happen after the person dies. It may be that changes, but that's an empirical issue. That's an is issue, not an ought issue. So shouldn't it be, to be consistent with the ethical standards and most ethical theories now, shouldn't it be that a person's virtuousness stands on its own, regardless of what people think, regardless of what cultures or subsequent cultures or ancestors think? They might think a person is virtuous or not, but that doesn't mean the person was virtuous or not in the way that the person is later judged by society. It should be, if ethics as we understand them are correct, it should be that there are objective standards which determine, which measure whether a person is virtuous or not, independent of what culture now or in the future think of that person.
Don't boo me off of the show, but I think that ethics, the way I have experienced it in terms of, because everyone has tried, anyone that calls himself a philosopher has tried to identify what is ethical at some point, most likely. I doubt there's any philosopher whose writings exist who did not at some point make some kind of claim about ethics, or at least studied it to some degree. And I think the fact alone that that most of these philosophers will disagree on what is objectively ethical is proof that there may not be an objective code of ethics to which the human race, needs to align itself in order to be considered ethical. But go ahead, Michael.
Yeah. Hold on.
Well,
I'm gonna jump in here because I think
Go
we're
ahead.
about to make a serious mistake. So in my course on I should turn this off. In my course on computer science and ethics, one of the things we talked about is theories of normative ethics. So there's Aristotelian virtue ethics, there's Kant's deontological ethics, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and there's utilitarian and consequentialist ethics. And those are theories that try to explain why things ought to be the way they are. But most of the time, these theories view, like if you put a certain situation, like, is it right to be violent in this situation? Most of them would all just say no. Even so that, like, so there is like this objective thing of like, you put all three ethical theories on most situations, and most of them always tell you to do the same things. It's only in like very specific, strange situations where these theories diverge. So, and the justifications are weird. But most of the time, and this is where I agree with Michael, there is this really objective type of ethics that we have to deal with. We theorize about why, it is objective in certain ways, but a lot of the time, these ethical theories, they converge much more than they diverge.
Yeah, I think, again, this is just a linguistic thing, because when I hear the word objective, I tend to think of something infallible, something 100%, which is to say that, for example, Aaron, just the fact that you said that there are places, specific scenarios, no matter how rare they might be, the fact that there are scenarios in which they might disagree on whether an action is ethical or unethical means that there's no objective, or in other words, there's no consistency to whether that action is ethical or not across all standpoints, because that's what you just described as a situation in which it's not. And I think, do you have something to add?
Well, the thing is that I think is really important to understand here is that human cultures, regardless of the time period, actually have very similar moral principles, far more than you can attribute to randomness.
Well, you gave the example of violence, right?
Yeah.
There are ethicists who would claim that violence in any description, in any form, is unethical.
Yeah.
Right? And you can make that claim.
Almost all cultures and almost all societies in human history have put they've put limits on violence. They put laws in place to protect people against violence, regardless of the culture. And that's evidence that there is some kind of underlying morality that we have as human beings because of the nature of the physical world, or for other reasons.
Perhaps, but that doesn't make it objective, because nowadays we have, for example, self-defense laws, right, which allow violence. As you say, there are limits, of course. You don't go out murdering people, but there are situations in which committing violence, for example, in self-defense, is something permissible by law, which in this case you can call that law representation of what we consider right and wrong in our society, right? Whereas there are societies perhaps in the past where any form of violence, be it self-defense or not, was totally reprehensible and frowned upon. And that just goes to show that violence is not objectively impermissible in every possible scenario from even an ethical standpoint, because to harm someone in self-defense, you're not considered unethical, because otherwise you would be judged under the extent of, for example, the law, which in some cases doesn't happen. So I would say there's no objectivism there. Even if you can identify trends, that doesn't mean something is objective.
Yeah, but we've kind of gotten off track, I think, into ethics, and I do want to bring it back to what we're talking about with virtue and a person's reputation. Can it change? Because I kind of am guilty of getting us off track. But before I do, I just want to say that I think you're making a mistake, Mihai. It's a mistake that that is sometimes made of confusing is with ought. So ethics is not an empirical study. The claim that, well, there could not be, or there must not be, objective ethical standards, because if we look from country to country or society to society, they have different standards. That is a fallacy. The fact that that some cultures don't recognize ethical standards does not prove that there are none. It just means that those countries or those people aren't recognizing them. But the claim normally in normative ethics is that there are objective standards, whether or not they're followed, whether or not they're adhered to. There are objective standards. And even the fact, what you're pointing out, Aaron, even the fact that there are many ethical theories, normative ethical theories, which diverge at times, does not in and of itself prove that there are no objective ethical standards. It just means that some theories are better than others at figuring out what they are and describing them. But the idea in normative ethics is that ethical systems strive to discover and to define and help guide us toward what are objective ethical standards. And to say that, well, all people don't recognize what they are or don't follow them is not at all evidence that they don't exist. But I do want to go back, to bring it back to Aristotle and virtue, which is that the same thing really applies to whether a person's virtuous. How can it be that if a person during his or her life behaves in a certain way, that there's something that can change about that? That's sort of like taking a position of ethical relativism. It's like saying that whether a person's virtuous or not depends on what society thinks, but actually it shouldn't. A person's virtue should be an intrinsic thing, and it should be an objective thing. Either the person acts virtuously or the person doesn't, regardless of what people think. Virtue, I don't think Aristotle defines a virtue as people think well of you, right? Aristotle defines virtue as very specific qualities, intrinsic qualities, right?
Yeah, I would say that's true. But so I don't get me wrong, I understand the concept here that of, normative ethical theory, that there, that it is an ought issue. I think what I'm struggling with, why I'm playing, so to speak, devil's advocate a little bit, is because this is an idea that I've grappled with for a long time and I still haven't quite settled on. So I appreciate the opportunity to go back and forth on this. But even Aristotle, who claims that there is a objective, a specific way in which someone should act intrinsically, in so that they are virtuous, as you claim, Mikey, that is Aristotle's stance. There is still room in his argument for subjectivism, and the reason I say that is because he talks about his golden mean, right? The fact that to act virtuously is to find the balance point between extremes, both extremes of which are vices, right? So to give too much money away, or to be stingy, there's a golden mean in there where you give just enough away that you are considered virtuous. But he makes the claim in his Nicomachean Ethics that mean is not the same for every person. For example, he talks about an athlete that needs to eat a lot of food by comparison to a normal person in order to keep their physical shape the way it is. And so their mean of not being a glutton but also not inflicting unnecessary pain on themselves, that mean of what they what they should consume is different than a person who is not an athlete, who say eats less than them. And so it's that gray area of subjectivism where even he says there's an objective way of doing things, virtue is intrinsic, and yet to each person it means something different. That's the part that I continue to grapple with, and that maybe muddies my my conception here of the subject. But it's something I think worth noting, that there's that element of subjectivism even in someone who is essentially the father of, as it is, virtue ethics, right, and objective virtuous standards.
Right, but the subjectivism you're describing, which is that different people may have, because of their situations, different points of demarcation where, as to where they fall on that continuum of, of the golden mean, right? Where Aristotle would advocate being towards the center and not toward the ends. That still isn't describing a situation where what other people think matters. It's still intrinsic. It's still intrinsic to that person or to that person's situation, the person's occupation or the person's life situation. But you're still not describing a situation where it's merely the judgment of other people that determine whether a person is virtuous or not. You're describing a situation where the person's life conditions determine whether the person is virtuous or not.
Well, and what about a situation then where, for example, in his time, we were talking about Alexander the Great, right? Which is a great tie-in to sort of wrap this up, and we can pick up this discussion another time, I'm sure. But for example, Alexander the Great was considered, was revered in his time of conquest, was revered as a wonderful general, a great example of human virtue, and he slaughtered hundreds of thousands. And so the definition at the time of what is considered ethical or virtuous was colored by the environment and the society and the norms in which those people lived. And so they perceived his actions. His actions are the same. Regardless, the past doesn't change in that what he did, his actions, were at some point real and physical and quantifiable. So that doesn't change. But the people around him in Greece saw that as perhaps he was virtuous and ethical. Whereas today, because our definitions have changed, we see him as someone who, it was maybe less ethical than that because he slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people. And so how is it that you can claim that there is a objective, virtuous sort of standpoint, and yet those definitions change over time? And so our definition, what we apply as virtue to him, changes over time. And I know you're going to say that that's an is issue, not an ought issue, that there ought to be, what ought to be virtuous doesn't necessarily change. But I don't see that that never reflects itself in the real physical world of interaction between people, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Oh, Mikey, we can't hear you.
Sorry, Mikey.
Okay. You're confusing, as you predicted, I am gonna say this, that you are confusing is with ought, and you're making a logical leap, an unjustified leap between the two. Whether Alexander the Great behaved virtuously is determined by his behavior, not by what cultures at one time or another think about his behavior. Now, what you're saying is that, virtuousness could not be an intrinsic thing because whether a person is labeled virtuous or not changes. But that's what I'm saying is the mistake. That's fallacious. Virtue, I'm saying, is a intrinsic quality. Either a person's virtuous or they're not, or maybe somewhere in between, right? They're on some continuum of virtuousness. What people think about it later has nothing to do with whether the person is virtuous or not. Just like the moral rightness or wrongness of me murdering somebody has nothing to do with what society thinks about the fact that I murdered that person. There must be something about murdering someone that is intrinsically right or wrong. And likewise, whether a person is virtuous must be intrinsic to that person's behavior, not to what people think about it. And the fact that people think different things about it doesn't change my argument. It just means that maybe some people judge incorrectly and some people judge correctly. The Germans who thought that Adolf Hitler was a great virtuous man were wrong, right? He wasn't a virtuous man. He was a mass murderer, right? And so people can be wrong in their assessments, but it doesn't change the intrinsic quality of the person they're assessing.
I think that about wraps up our time here, but I really appreciate the discussion and the chance to go back and forth. I'm sure this is a subject we'll return to at a later date, because I think we all have lots to say on it. You've been listening to the Canadian Philosophy Show. Behind the mic hosting, once again, is Mihai Covaser, and I had with me Michael Robert Caditz and Aaron Wang to talk about Aristotle and something about ethics, virtue, and identity. You can, if you're listening on the radio, you can find our shows and all of our archives on mixcloud.com/The Canadian Philosophy Show. Again, that's mixcloud.com/The Canadian Philosophy Show. And we welcome your questions and comments on that site as well. Thanks a lot for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.